Why would parents give their oldest son a broken cabin in the middle of Alaska while handing their younger son an $800,000 mansion? How does a man go from being called a pathetic loser by his own fiancée to finding the one thing every person in the family missed? What exactly was waiting behind that cabin door? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Aaron Holt. I'm 42 years old, and 2 months ago my life split into a before and an after in the space of one sentence from my fiancée. The funny thing is, the night it happened started like any normal Tuesday. I was in our small one-bedroom apartment in Queens, finishing a report for work at the kitchen table. I'm a mechanical engineer. I spend most of my days solving quiet problems that nobody sees. Airflow issues, vibration problems, things that don't make for exciting stories at parties but keep machines from falling apart. Rachel was in the bedroom, getting ready for a dinner with her friends. She walked out in a dark green dress I'd never seen before, with new heels and a new bag. She looked expensive and sharp. I told her she looked beautiful. She gave me a quick, distracted smile and asked if I had transferred my share of the rent yet. I said I would do it in the morning. Payday was tomorrow. I'd told her that twice already that week. She sighed, the long, heavy type of sigh she had started using more and more. She said it made her nervous when I cut it that close. She said she didn't want to live paycheck to paycheck forever. I told her I didn't either. I told her I had applied for a promotion, that my manager thought it looked good. I tried to sound confident. She stared at my worn-out work laptop and the simple dinner on the stove. Pasta and cheap sauce. She said she was tired of hearing about maybe soon. We had small fights like that a lot in those days, but they usually burned out fast. This time, her tone felt different, sharper, like something inside her had already changed and she was just catching me up. She checked her phone again, then put it down on the counter. She asked if I remembered the dinner at my parents' house on Saturday. The family announcement. The will reading. Of course I remembered. My father had been talking about updating the will for years. My parents had money. Not billionaire money, but comfortable forever money. They owned a big place upstate that everyone in the family called the mansion, even though it wasn't technically one. They had investments, retirement funds, all of that. I was the oldest son. My brother Tyler, 8 years younger, had always joked that he didn't need an inheritance because he would build his own fortune. He liked to call himself an entrepreneur. He spent most of his time working on ideas on his laptop in coffee shops. Rachel asked if I thought my parents would help us out, finally. Maybe gift us part of the house value or something like that. She said it with a hopeful edge that made my stomach tight. I told her the truth. I had no idea. My parents didn't share details with me. They liked surprises. She frowned and told me she was tired of surprises that involved waiting. She asked why I didn't push my parents more. She said Tyler was always getting help, and I just sat there and accepted it. She wasn't wrong. Tyler always seemed to land on his feet. My parents paid his college tuition in full. When his first startup failed, they helped him pay off the loans. When he moved to the city, they helped with his deposit. When I asked my dad once if he could help me with my own student loans, he said it was important for me to build character. I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I told Rachel that whatever my parents decided, it was their choice. It felt weak, even as I said it. She watched me for a long moment, and something hard settled in her eyes. She said she couldn't keep doing this. I asked what this meant. She told me she was 31. She said her friends were marrying lawyers, doctors, finance guys, people who were already living in nice buildings in Manhattan, taking vacations, planning kids. She said she loved me, but love didn't pay for stability. It didn't pay for a better apartment. It didn't pay for private school for the children she wanted someday. I told her I was working on it. I reminded her that we had talked about building our life slowly, saving first, being careful. I reminded her that she had always said she admired how steady I was. She said she had changed. She walked toward the door, grabbed her purse, then stopped and turned back to me. Her voice was calm and cold now, not angry. That hurt more than if she had screamed. She said I was a pathetic loser for still begging my parents for scraps at 42. Pathetic loser. She said I would never amount to anything because I never demanded anything, never fought for more. I just took what I was given. She said she couldn't tie herself to a man who was waiting for mommy and daddy to save him. Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door. Our neighbor from down the hall, an older woman, was there to pick up a package she'd had delivered to our place by mistake. She stepped into the doorway, saw Rachel's face, saw mine, and froze. Rachel smiled at her, that polite, distant smile she used with strangers, and brushed past both of us. She told the neighbor we were just having a talk and that she really had to go. Then she was gone. The neighbor looked at me with soft, uncomfortable eyes. She handed me the package and said I should take care of myself. I nodded. I closed the door. I put the package on the counter and sat back at the kitchen table. The report on my laptop screen stared back at me. Somewhere in the building, I heard Rachel's heels clicking down the hallway, then the elevator door opening and closing. After that, there was silence. I don't remember how long I sat there. At some point, I finished my report, sent the email, and turned off the computer almost on autopilot. I washed the dishes to have something to do with my hands. I lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I thought about every time Rachel had told me she believed in me. Every time she'd said she didn't care about money, only about a good man. I wondered when that had stopped being true, and if I had missed the moment, or if it had never been real in the first place. By the time Saturday came and I drove upstate to my parents' house, I was mostly numb. The mansion sat on a hill outside a small town, with a long driveway lined with tall trees. I'd grown up there. I knew every crack in the main hallway tiles, every creaking stair. But as I walked up to the front door that day, I felt like a guest. Tyler's car was already parked out front, a shiny leased SUV. He liked to talk about how smart he was with leases, how it freed up his cash for investments. My sedan looked tired beside it. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She looked happy and stressed at the same time, like a hostess at a party she wasn't sure people would enjoy. She hugged me, told me I looked thin, asked if I'd been eating properly. She didn't ask about Rachel. My father sat in the living room armchair, a thick envelope on the table. Tyler lounged on the couch with his legs spread wide, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and grinned when he saw me. He said he was surprised I'd made it on time. He joked that he thought I'd be busy working on some charity project for the company or something boring like that. I smiled a small, polite smile and took the armchair opposite my father. My father cleared his throat. He said he and my mother had been thinking about the future, about estate planning, about fairness. Fairness. He said it was better to be open and efficient about these things rather than leaving them to chance. He said he wanted no fights after they were gone. Then he picked up the envelope. He said the lawyer had already prepared everything and we would get copies later, but he wanted us to hear it from him. He started listing assets, bank accounts, investments, the house, the smaller vacation properties. The words washed over me. I heard numbers. I heard terms. Then he said that the house we were sitting in, the big property north of the city, would go entirely to Tyler. No split, no shared ownership, no sale and equal division, no rental income. Just Tyler. My mother nodded along, watching Tyler with soft eyes. Tyler's face lit up. He pretended to be surprised. He said they were being too generous. He said he would take good care of the place. My father waved that off and said it made sense. He said Tyler was the more social one, the one more likely to host and keep the family together. He said I was more private. He said he doubted I even wanted a big house like this. He said I seemed happiest alone. Then he mentioned a second property, a cabin in Alaska. He said it like it was a funny footnote, some old investment he'd made decades ago. A small cabin in the middle of nowhere on a piece of land he'd never had time to develop. He said it was more your speed, Aaron, quiet, simple. He said they were leaving that to me. Tyler laughed. He said that sounded about right. The golden son gets the mansion, the quiet one gets the shack in the snow. He said at least I'd have peace and fresh air. He suggested I could finally write that novel I always talked about, even though I'd never once mentioned writing a novel. My mother didn't say anything. She just watched me carefully, like she was waiting for a reaction. I just nodded. My father slid a thin stack of papers across the table. The top document had my name on it and an address in Alaska in small print. The rest was legal language I didn't fully read in that moment. At the back, clipped to the deed, was a smaller white envelope with my name written by hand. Aaron, in my father's old, careful handwriting. I looked at it, then at him. He had already turned back to Tyler, talking about repair costs, taxes, upgrades he wanted Tyler to consider for the house. It was like the cabin conversation was already over. Tyler stood up, walked behind my chair, and patted my shoulder. He said this was perfect. He said I could play mountain man while he kept the family base running. He said we all had our roles. When my mother walked me to the door later, she put a hand on my arm. She said this was fair. She said I liked simple things. She said Tyler had more social responsibilities. I told her I understood. She asked if Rachel was coming up later. I told her no. She didn't ask why. I stepped out onto the front steps. The late afternoon sun was bright. Tyler's laugh drifted from inside the house. I walked to my car slowly, the deed folder under my arm. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification popped up on the screen. Property transfer, pending review? I stared at the message for a long moment, my hand still on the car door handle, and felt something small but sharp move in my chest. I didn't open the notification right away. I sat in the car with the engine off and the driver's seat slowly getting cold underneath me. The sound of birds in the trees was louder than I remembered. The house behind me had long windows that reflected the sky and nothing of what was happening inside. My parents were still talking, I could tell. Their voices carried faintly through the open upstairs window. Tyler's laugh floated out above everything else. It sounded like someone winning a game he thought he deserved to win. I finally unlocked my phone and tapped the notification. It was a simple message from a digital document service. It said I had been added as the primary owner on property ID Holt, Alaska 01. It showed today's date and my father's name as the one who initiated the transfer. Below that, there was a button to view more details. I didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. For the first time in a long time, I let myself think about how I'd gotten here. Not the drive from the city, the bigger here, the life here. People think the older child has all the power, the firstborn, the one the parents practice on. In our family, it never felt like that. Growing up, I was the quiet one. I liked books, puzzles, taking apart old radios I found in thrift stores and trying to put them back together. I liked sitting on the floor near the sofa while my father watched the news, drawing simple machines and trying to understand how gears worked. Tyler was noise from the moment he could walk. He ran, shouted, climbed things he wasn't supposed to climb. He broke a lamp once, and my mother laughed and said he was full of life. When I broke something, it was because I wasn't careful. I got good grades without much trouble. They praised me for that, but in a light way, like it was expected. When Tyler barely passed, they cheered like he had climbed a mountain. At family gatherings, aunts and uncles would always ask Tyler about his plans. He had big, dramatic ones. He wanted to be a rock star, then a movie director, then a tech founder. They loved those stories. When people asked me what I wanted to be, I said I liked building things. I said I wanted to be an engineer. They nodded politely and told me that sounded solid, safe, boring. When my grandmother got sick my last year of high school, someone needed to stay close to home and help. My parents never said it directly, but it was understood. Tyler still had soccer practice and parties and his youth. I was the one who drove my grandmother to appointments, sat with her in the afternoons, picked up prescriptions. I didn't resent it at the time. It felt like what you do for family. But looking back, a pattern starts to show. I took a state university an hour from home. It wasn't the most famous, but it had a good engineering program, and I could commute sometimes, help out, still be there. My parents said they were proud I chose something practical. When it was time for Tyler to go to college, things looked different. He didn't want state school, he wanted out-of-state tuition and a campus that looked good in pictures. My parents sat him down and told him they would make it work. For him, they took out a second mortgage on the house. When I finished my degree, I had student loans and a used car that belonged more to the bank than to me. When Tyler finished his degree, he had stories and connections and no debt. And still, somehow, I was the one with the stable life, and he was the one with potential. I started my first job at a small engineering firm doing basic machine maintenance plans. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked it. The first year, I visited home almost every weekend to help my parents fix things. Leaky pipes, broken steps, their internet, whatever came up. Tyler visited less. When he did, he brought new ideas and big talk about investments and startups. My father's eyes shone when Tyler spoke. He loved the energy, the risk. When my parents' health started to decline, I was the one who drove them to appointments and waited in lobbies. Tyler called to ask how they were and told them he was building something huge and would help them soon. He always said soon. I realized I had been saying soon a lot too. Soon my promotion, soon a better apartment, soon a wedding with Rachel, soon a life where I didn't feel like I was always standing in the corner of my own story. The difference was, I believed I had to earn soon. Tyler believed it would just arrive. I drove back to the city after the will reading, the deed folder on the seat beside me. Traffic was heavy near the bridge, then slow and choked in Queens, like always. I parked in my usual spot on the street and carried the folder upstairs. The apartment was quiet. Rachel's shoes were still near the door, the pair she always said hurt but looked amazing. Her jacket hung on the hook, her perfume lingered. Her ring was gone from the dish near the sink. I put the folder on the table, made myself a sandwich I barely tasted, and finally picked up my phone. No texts from her, just the property transfer notification and a message from Tyler. He had sent it to our family group chat. A photo of him in the living room of the mansion, arms spread, grinning wide. The caption said something about new house, same old Tyler. There were already emojis from cousins and relatives. My mother had commented that she was so proud. No mention of Alaska. I didn't add anything to the chat. Instead, I opened the property message and clicked View Details. It was mostly legal language, parcel numbers and measurements I didn't fully understand, but one thing stood out. Under property size, it did not say cabin or small lot. It listed acres. More than I expected. A lot more. Still, numbers on a screen can feel unreal. It could be an error. It could be nothing. My father had once tried buying land for a business idea that never went anywhere. Maybe this was that? Old dreams rotting under snow. I closed the document and turned my attention to work. On Monday, my manager called me into his office. He said he had been impressed with my handling of a difficult project. He said the promotion I'd applied for was in a good place, but budgets were tight. Maybe next quarter. Maybe soon. He asked how things were going with Rachel. I told him we were taking some space. He gave me that uncomfortable sympathy look people use when they want to be kind but don't know how. He said I deserved someone who understood what steadiness meant. That night, I lay awake and thought about steadiness, about how often it gets confused with weakness, with passivity, with being boring, safe, unambitious. I thought about how my parents saw Tyler's chaos as brilliance and my stability as background noise. 2 weeks later, my father called. His voice sounded weaker than usual, breath shorter. He said he hoped I wasn't upset about the will. I told him I was fine. He said he knew I would be. He said I was reasonable like always. He mentioned the cabin as if it were a joke prize in a raffle. It's a simple place, he said. A bit run down. But it fits you. Peace and quiet. No pressure. He didn't ask if I even wanted peace and quiet. He didn't ask what I wanted at all. After we hung up, I stared at the wall and realized something that should have been obvious years ago. My family had put me into a box, the quiet son, the steady one, the one who would understand, the one who would accept less without complaint. The support beam in the house that nobody sees but everybody uses. Rachel had put me in a similar box. The safe backup plan, the man she would marry if nothing better appeared fast enough, the one who would never leave, never demand more, never surprise her. And I had helped them all build that box. By staying quiet, by staying steady, by saying it's fine when it wasn't fine, by telling myself that being the calm one was my role. The cabin in Alaska was just the latest version of that story, the simple gift for the simple son. 2 nights before I booked the flight, Tyler called me directly. That didn't happen often unless he wanted something. He sounded excited, breathless. He said he was already talking to a designer about remodeling the mansion. He said there were so many cool things he could do with it. A home theater, a game room, an outdoor bar. He asked if I wanted to come up one weekend and help with some manual stuff, since I was good with tools. I told him I was thinking of going to Alaska to look at the cabin instead. He laughed like I'd made a joke. Then his tone changed. He said I should think carefully before I wasted time on a shack in the snow. He said I should be realistic. He said some people were meant for big things and some people weren't. He told me I should accept my place. He didn't say I was replaceable. He didn't need to. It was in every word. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, phone still in my hand. In the quiet, I heard Rachel's old words again, layered over Tyler's. Pathetic loser. Never amount to anything. That was the night the switch flipped. Not anger, not rage. Something sharper, cleaner. Clarity. I opened my laptop and searched flights to Alaska. The prices made my stomach twist, but I booked one anyway. Economy seat, early morning departure, 2 connections, and a final leg on a small plane. I printed the confirmations. I pulled the deed folder from my desk and slipped it into my carry-on bag. The next morning, I told my manager I needed vacation days. He raised an eyebrow, but approved them. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, so I gave him a simple one. Family property I needed to check on. He wished me luck. That Friday, I stood in the long line at JFK Security with tired travelers and crying children and stressed business people. I held my boarding pass in one hand and my passport in the other. My carry-on felt heavier than it should have. When I finally sat down at the gate, I pulled out the white envelope my father had clipped to the deed. I'd been carrying it for days without opening it. The paper was thick, old-fashioned, my name on the front in his careful handwriting. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the edges. For a moment, I thought about ripping it up and throwing it away. Going back home, letting things stay the way everyone expected them to be. Then I thought about Tyler's laugh, my mother's careful eyes, Rachel's voice calling me a pathetic loser. My father's casual comment about the cabin being more my speed. I slipped a finger under the flap and started to tear it open. Before I could pull the paper out, a shadow fell across my hands. A flight attendant stood beside my seat, holding a small padded envelope with a printed label. She asked if I was Aaron Holt. I said yes. She smiled politely and said something had been dropped off for me to be given during the flight. She placed the package on my tray table, nodded, and walked away. I stared at the padded envelope in front of me, the white envelope in my hand, and felt the plane's engines begin to hum. I opened the white envelope first. The plane had just taken off. The city fell away under the wings, turning into little squares of light. People around me buckled seatbelts, took out headphones, opened snacks. It all felt distant. The envelope paper was thick and rough. My father's handwriting ran across the front. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. It was not long. He wrote that he hoped I would not be angry about the way things were divided. He wrote that he had always trusted me to understand. He said the cabin was mine in truth, not just on paper. He said it would give me something no one could take from me. He added one line at the end that made me pause. He wrote that there were things tied to that land that my mother and Tyler had never cared about, never asked about, and never would. He wrote that if I ever wanted to stop being the quiet one, I should start there. There were no explanations, no map, no numbers, just that. I folded the page back up and slid it into the seat pocket in front of me, then picked up the padded envelope the flight attendant had brought. The label on it had my name and today's date. The sender line was a simple return address for a law office I recognized from my parents' town. Victor Hahn, the family attorney. I had seen his name on letters before, always on documents my parents discussed without me. Inside the padded envelope was a small black notebook, a metal key on a thin ring, and a business card. The card had Victor's name, his office number, his email. On the back, someone had written a short message in careful blue ink. It said I should call him after I had looked under the floor. I stared at that line for a long time, looked under the floor. I turned the metal key in my fingers. It was not a house key. It was shorter, thicker, with a square head and a rough stem. It looked like it belonged to a cabinet or a lockbox. The notebook was filled with small, neat writing. At first I thought they were random numbers, but then I saw the pattern. Coordinates, dates, short notes about visits. Snow higher this year. Survey guys stopped by, told them no. Tell Victor to update file. The last entry was from almost 3 years ago. My father had underlined a short sentence. Do not let them sell this out from under Aaron. I closed the notebook and sat back, feeling the weight of the key in my palm. The plane hummed around me. Someone behind me laughed at a movie on their tablet. A baby cried 2 rows ahead. For a moment, the small locked world of the cabin was more real to me than the chair I was sitting in. I checked my phone. Still nothing from Rachel, nothing from my parents. Tyler had posted another photo in the group chat, this time of the house from the outside with a caption about new beginnings. I muted the conversation. The main flight passed in a blur. I dozed, woke, drank bad coffee, watched patches of snow and rock pass far below as we moved north and west. In the connecting airport, I ate a stale sandwich and sat in a plastic chair at a gate that smelled like fuel and wet coats. The last leg was on a small plane with only a handful of seats. There were no city lights below this time, just dark forest and a pale strip of river. The pilot, a broad-shouldered man with a beard, shouted back at us during takeoff that the weather looked cooperative enough. His voice was casual, like this was just another bus route. When we landed, the runway was a narrow strip of packed snow beside a low metal hangar. Wind cut through my jacket the second I stepped down onto the ground. The air smelled different, cleaner, colder, like everything had been washed. The pilot pointed toward a squat building with a lit window and told me that was the office. He said my ride to the Holt place would meet me there. He said it like everyone knew what the Holt place was. Inside the office, the walls were covered with photos of planes and fish. A woman at a desk asked my name, checked it against a printed list, and told me someone had called ahead about me. She said there was an old truck outside I could borrow to get to the cabin. She said the keys were in it. When I stepped back out, another person was leaning against the rusted truck hood. A man in a thick parka and a knit cap pulled low. He had the kind of face that had seen a lot of winters. He introduced himself as Caleb, the local ranger. He said he'd known my father. He said my father had been stubborn as a rock about that land. The way he said it, it didn't sound like an insult. He asked if I knew how to drive on snow and ice. I told him I'd figure it out. He looked at me for a second, then said he'd go ahead on his snowmobile and I could follow slowly. He said he didn't want to be the one to explain to a lawyer how the New York Sun ended up in a ditch. I could hear my brother's laugh echoing in that phrase. New York sun, city boy, out of his depth. The road out of the small town turned to a narrower track quickly. Trees closed in on both sides, heavy with snow. The truck rattled over frozen ruts. My hands stayed tight on the steering wheel as I tried to keep the tires in the pair of tracks in front of me. It took longer than I expected to reach the cabin. By the time Caleb raised his arm and pointed off the road, my neck hurt from leaning forward. My eyes burned from staring through the windshield. I turned onto a smaller lane, barely more than 2 lines pressed into the snow. The trees opened up suddenly, and there it was, the Holt cabin. From my father's stories, I had pictured something simple but solid. A neat wooden place with smoke coming from a stone chimney, a postcard. What stood in front of me looked tired. The porch sagged on one side. 2 of the front windows were boarded up, and one had a long crack across the glass. The roof had a section near the corner that had clearly fallen in and been roughly patched with a sheet of metal. The wooden siding was gray and bare, where paint had peeled away. The place was not a postcard. It was a person who had been left alone for too long. I stepped out of the truck. The snow crunched loudly under my boots. The cold bit into my cheeks, instantly sharp. Caleb cut his engine and walked over. He said my father had done repairs himself for years, but it had been a while since anyone stayed here for more than a week. He said the storms hit hard. He said things rot fast if someone isn't watching. He handed me a small flashlight and told me the generator might or might not still work. He pointed toward the side of the cabin where a metal tank sat half buried in snow. He said I should check the level before trying to run anything for long. Then he asked if I needed anything else. His tone was professional, but his eyes were curious. People out here always wanted to know what brought someone so far. I told him I was just here to look around and check on the place. I didn't mention the key in my pocket or the note about looking under the floor. He nodded, said I could reach him on the radio at the ranger station if anything serious came up. Then he started his snowmobile and left the way we had come, the sound of the engine fading into the trees. For a minute, it was just me and the cabin and the wind. I walked up the steps slowly, testing each board with my weight. One creaked loud enough to make my chest tighten, but it held. The front door was locked. I pulled out the ring of keys the woman at the office had given me and tried them one by one until one turned. The smell inside hit me first. Old dust, cold wood, something faintly damp, like wet clothes forgotten in a corner. There were simple things. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs, a metal stove in the corner, open shelves with a few pans, cups, and plates. A faded rug covered the middle of the floor. The light from the open door reached only so far. Beyond that, everything turned into shapes. I flipped a switch by the door out of habit. Nothing happened. In the back, I found a small bathroom with a cracked mirror and a dry sink. Another tiny room held stacked boxes with my father's handwriting on them. Canned food, tools. Misk! I tried the generator next. Outside, I brushed snow off the tank. The gauge needle hovered just above empty. Inside a small shed attached to the cabin, the generator sat under a tarp. It looked old, but not lost. I checked the oil, then tried the starter. It coughed, sputtered, and caught. A rough humming filled the air. Inside, one ceiling light flickered on weakly. With light, the place looked even more tired, but less like a cave. Cobwebs shone in corners. The rug was more worn than it had seemed. On the wall near the table, a cluster of papers was pinned up. Maps and hand-drawn notes. I walked closer. One map showed the cabin and the woods around it. Another showed a larger area, with the cabin a tiny dot near the corner. Long lines marked out sections with numbers beside them. My father had drawn some of the lines in darker pen, with arrows pointing to them. Without context, they were just lines. I took out my phone and snapped photos of everything. The maps, the pinholes, the notes in my father's cramped writing. Boundary here. Other offer went nowhere. Ask V. I knew who V was now. I found his notebook in my pocket and flipped to a page with a date that matched one of the notes on the wall. The wording matched. The visit, the survey, the decision to say no. Something was here. Something besides a broken cabin and lonely trees. As I stood there trying to put the pieces together, the front door opened behind me. A woman in a thick coat and fur hat stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. Her hair was gray, braided behind her back. Her eyes were sharp in a kind face. She said she was Nora Reed, my nearest neighbor. She said nearest meant half a mile through the trees. She said she had seen the truck and figured I must be Martin's son. I told her who I was. She nodded like that fit something she already knew. She said my father had talked about me sometimes. She said he had called me the steady one. Her mouth made a small shape when she said it, like she wasn't sure if it was praise or apology. She looked around the cabin and shook her head. She said it needed work. She said he had planned to do more last summer, but never made it up. She asked if I knew what I had here. I said I had an old cabin and a lot of snow. She smiled at that, but her eyes stayed serious. She said there had been people sniffing around for years, asking about land, about rights, about the hills behind the lake. She said my father had sent them away. She said he had told them this place was for his family, not for them. Then she looked at the rug in the center of the floor. She asked if I had checked under it yet. She said my father had always liked to hide things in plain sight. She said once he had kept a whole box of important papers under a loose board in his pantry back home. I told her I had only just arrived. She nodded and said she would leave me to settle in. She wrote her radio channel on a scrap of paper and told me to call if something felt wrong. After she left, the cabin felt different, less empty, more like a room waiting for someone to notice it properly. The generator hummed steady in the background. The weak light above the table swung slightly in a draft I couldn't place. I walked into the small bedroom, dropped my bag on the bed, and sat down for a moment. The boards under my feet felt uneven. I stood up again and went back to the main room. The rug Nora had looked at sat heavy and slightly askew. It had a worn oval path across it, where someone had walked over and over. My heart started beating faster, not from fear, but from something else. Anticipation. I grabbed one corner of the rug and pulled it back. Beneath, the wooden floor gave way to a square of dark metal set flush into the boards. In the center of the metal was a small recessed ring, like a handle. I reached down and wrapped my fingers around the cold steel. The ring was stiff and cold. I had to pull hard before it finally lifted with a scraping sound. The metal panel didn't swing up easily. It felt heavy, like it hadn't been moved in years. Dust fell into the gap as it rose. Underneath, instead of dirt or stone, I saw a dark square and the top of a short wooden ladder leading down. I grabbed the flashlight Caleb had given me and shone it into the opening. The space below was small, more like a crawl space than a real basement. The walls were lined with rough boards. The floor looked like poured concrete. On one side, pushed up against the wall, was a steel cabinet about as tall as my chest and wide as a fridge. There were also plastic crates, a few cardboard boxes, and a coiled extension cord lying in a heap. I climbed down slowly, testing each rung. The air down there was colder and smelled like metal and paper. The generator's hum sounded deeper, like it was coming through the bones of the cabin. The steel cabinet had a lock near the top. The shape of the keyhole made something tighten in my chest. I reached into my pocket and took out the thick metal key from Victor's envelope. It slid in smoothly. For a second, I didn't turn it. I stood there in the dim beam of the flashlight, one hand on the key, one on the edge of the cabinet, and thought about every time in my life someone had told me I was the steady one, the simple one, the one who didn't need much. Then I turned the key. The lock opened with a solid click. The cabinet doors creaked when I pulled them apart. Inside were rows of labeled folders, stacked binders, and a few hard plastic cases. My father's handwriting ran across almost every label. Dates from 20, 30 years ago. Names I didn't recognize. Short words I did. Surveys. Rights. Offers. Refused. On the bottom shelf, a metal box like a small safe sat pushed to the back. It had no visible lock, just a latch sealed with old tape. Next to it was a slim black external hard drive with a sticky note on it. Ask V before plugging in. I swallowed. The air felt even colder. I reached for one of the folders at random. The label said, Surveys, Early. Inside were printed reports with maps attached. I didn't understand all the technical wording, but I saw a few things clearly. The outline of the land was huge. The cabin was just a tiny dot in one corner of a much larger shape. There were shaded areas marked with strange patterns, numbers listed in columns. Some sections had been circled in red pen. In the margins, my father had written short notes. Better than expected. Confirm with second team. Do not rush. I flipped through more pages. On another sheet, a logo from a company I didn't know sat at the top. There was a short letter attached to the report. I didn't read it fully, but one sentence caught my eye. It mentioned an interest in acquisition and very favorable terms. Another folder had the word offers written on it in thick pen. Inside were more letters, different company names, all with the same careful, formal tone. They wanted something under this land, and they were willing to pay. I put the folder back, hands slightly shaking. Not from fear, from the feeling of standing near something big and not yet knowing its shape. On one side of the cabinet, a thin binder was labeled VH Copies. I opened it. The first page had Victor's full name and firm printed at the top. My father had handwritten a list underneath, each line starting with a date and a short description. Filed. Updated. Confirmed. Recorded with state. I closed the binder before I could see more. The rule from Victor's card echoed in my head. Call after you look under the floor. Well, I had looked. I spent the next hour taking photos. Every folder label, the outside of each binder, a few key pages that showed the full outline of the land. I didn't pull out everything. It felt wrong to mix it up before someone who understood it could see it. Finally, my fingers were too cold to keep working. I closed the cabinet, locked it again, climbed back up the ladder, and pulled the metal panel down. The rug flopped back over the spot with a soft thud. The cabin looked normal again, but I knew it wasn't. I went outside to clear my head. The air hit my face like a slap. Behind the cabin, a narrow path led through the trees. My father's boot prints weren't there, of course, but I could see where feet had worn a trail over time. I followed it. The trees thinned out after a few minutes. The path opened up to a frozen lake, wide and flat, the surface covered by a smooth layer of snow. On the far side, I saw bright flags sticking out of the ground at regular intervals, red and orange, flapping weakly in the wind. I walked closer. The flags were attached to thin metal poles driven into the ground. Some had bits of tape on them with faded writing. At first I thought they were for hunters, but then I noticed they lined up in straight lines, creating invisible boxes across the landscape, survey markers. I recognized a few numbers from the maps in the cabinet. Same codes, same rough shapes. I turned slowly, taking in the scene. The cabin on its little rise, the trees, the lake, the markers stretching into the distance. It hit me then that what I had thought of as some land around a cabin was nothing like that. This was a lot. Maybe miles. I pulled out my phone and took photos until my fingers hurt too much to hold it. Then I went back to the cabin, sat at the wobbly table, and pulled Victor's card from my pocket. I hesitated only once before dialing. He picked up on the third ring. His voice sounded exactly like I remembered it from the rare times I'd heard him speak at family events. Calm, careful, as if every word was measured. He greeted me by name. That surprised me more than it should have. I wasn't sure he'd remember my voice. He said he'd been expecting my call one of these days, which surprised me even more. I told him where I was. I told him I'd found the notebook, the key, the cabinet under the floor. I told him I hadn't read everything, just enough to know there was more here than anyone had told me. He asked a few short questions. Did I see survey records? Yes. Did I see correspondence from outside companies? Yes. Did I see anything that looked like final agreements signed by my father? I said I didn't know. I'd closed the binder before reading that far. He told me that was good. He said the less I tried to interpret right now, the better. He said everything I'd described matched the file he had in his office, but with more detail. He said my father had asked him to keep certain things quiet until I came looking on my own. I asked what certain things meant. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked me to describe the shape of the land on the largest map I'd seen. I did, tracing it in the air with my finger as if he could see it. He hummed thoughtfully and said it matched his copies. He told me very clearly to do 3 things. First, take pictures of everything and back them up in at least 2 places. Second, do not throw out or move any original documents yet. Third, tell no one in my family what I had found. Not yet. He said he understood that sounded dramatic, but it mattered. He said there were conditions and timelines and filings connected to this land that could be affected if my parents or my brother tried to move pieces around. I asked him a simple question then, the one that had been pressing on my chest since I opened that cabinet. What did they think they were giving me? I said. When my father left me the cabin, did they know what was under it? He was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said my father knew exactly what he was doing. He said my mother knew in broad strokes, enough to worry but not enough to understand all the details. He said he was almost certain Tyler had no idea, because if he had, he would never have let the cabin pass so easily. He said my father had called the cabin the anchor. The word sat in my ear like a stone. Victor told me he'd call again after he reviewed his files and made sure everything was still in order on his end. Until then, he said, I should just document and observe. Let them think you're up there camping, he said. That's the story they already believe. We hung up. I stared at the phone for a while after the call ended. The generator hummed. The light flickered once and steadied. I spent the rest of the afternoon taking more photos. Every page of the notebook, close-ups of dates, company logos, my father's handwritten notes. I created folders on my phone and labeled them clearly. Maps. Letters. Markers. Cabinet. When the light outside started to fade, I walked back to the lake once more. The sky turned orange, then deep blue. The flags across the ice looked like strange flowers in the snow. On my way back to the cabin, I saw a thin column of smoke rising through the trees. Not from my chimney, from somewhere off to the right. I realized that must be Nora's place. Later, when darkness settled fully and the generator's noise felt too loud, I turned it off. The cabin fell into deep quiet. The stars outside were brighter than anything I'd seen above New York. I lay in the narrow bed, fully dressed under 2 blankets, and listened to the cracking of the wood as it adjusted to the night. Every now and then, a pop would make my muscles tense. Out here, small sounds felt big. At some point, sleep finally found me. In the morning, I walked to Nora's cabin to return the flashlight and ask a few questions. Her place was smaller than mine, but felt warmer, lived in. There were photos on the walls and the smell of coffee in the air. She poured me a mug without asking if I wanted one. Out here, some things were assumed. I asked her how long she'd known my father. She said a long time. Long enough to know he was stubborn, long enough to know he didn't trust companies that came waiving contracts. She said survey teams had been around more than once, leaving their little flags and measurements. She said one winter, some men in nice jackets came and tried to charm the town, promised jobs, promised investment, promised a new road. My father had refused them, even when others were tempted. I asked what they wanted. She tapped the table with one finger. Said some people believed there was money under the hills, minerals, metals. Whatever word you used, it meant the same thing, things you could take out of the ground and sell. She said my father had told her once that he wasn't against using what was there, but he didn't want to lose control. He didn't want to sign something and wake up one day with strangers telling his family they needed to move. We talked for a while longer. I didn't tell her about the cabinet. She didn't ask. On my way back, I stopped by the small building that served as both general store and post office in town. People inside glanced up when I walked in. A few nodded in that short, curious way people in small places do when they see someone new but don't want to stare. I bought batteries, canned food, a thicker pair of gloves. The man behind the counter asked if I was Martin's boy. When I said yes, his eyebrows went up. He said my father had been a good negotiator. He said when those companies came through, they always seemed confident, but they always left frustrated. He said he hoped I had inherited that stubborn streak. On the way back to the cabin, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't check it. Reception out here was weak and spotty, and part of me liked the idea of being unreachable. But the screen lit up with something I couldn't ignore. It was a message in the family group chat from my mother. A long one, with too many emojis. At the end, there was an attached image of an invitation. She wrote that they were planning a big inheritance celebration dinner at the house in 3 weeks. She said it would be a chance for everyone to see Tyler's new home and honor the family legacy. She said it would mean a lot if I came. I downloaded the image and zoomed in. At the top, in big gold letters, the invitation said, "Celebrating Tyler Holt and the Holt family legacy." I stared at the invitation on my phone until the words blurred. Celebrating Tyler Holt and the Holt family legacy. Not Holt family. Not Martin and Elaine's sons. Just Tyler and something vague called legacy that apparently now lived in the walls of the house I'd grown up in. My mother's message underneath said she hoped I could make it. She added that it would be a beautiful night for everyone to move forward, as if that was what this was about. Moving forward, not about drawing a bright line between the sun with the mansion and the sun with the cabin. I put the phone down on the table and looked at the maps pinned to the wall again. The lake, the flags, the lines stretching out in every direction, the tiny dot where the cabin sat. I heard my father's line from his letter in my head. If you ever want to stop being the quiet one, start here. I picked the phone back up and scrolled through my photos. The surveys, the binder labels, the notebook pages, the flags in the snow, the shape of the land. 3 weeks until that dinner. My first instinct was to decline, to stay here, far away from all of it. Let them have their party, their speeches, their photos. Let them build whatever story they wanted about legacy while I figured out what to do with the land. But somewhere under that instinct, something else moved. The same small, sharp thing that had pushed me to book the flight in the first place. If I stayed here, nothing in their story would change. I would remain what I'd always been for them, the distant, harmless one they didn't have to take seriously, the one they could pity and ignore. If anything was going to change, it had to change where they were. On the stage they had built for themselves. I opened a new message to my mother and stared at the empty text box for a long moment. Then I wrote that I'd be there. I added a small, "looking forward to it," that sounded polite even to me. She replied almost immediately with a string of heart emojis and a note saying how happy that made her. Tyler added a thumbs up in the chat and wrote that he would make sure there was a quiet corner for me if the party felt too loud. A little joke, the kind he always made. I muted the conversation again. The next 3 days in Alaska were not exciting in the way movies make these things seem. There were no dramatic chases, no strangers in black SUVs, no sudden visits from company men. There was just steady work. Every morning, I made coffee on the stove, turned on the generator for a few hours, and went back down into the space under the floor. I worked slowly, carefully. I pulled out one folder at a time, read the labels, took photos of the covers, checked for any pages that looked especially important or final. I didn't try to interpret everything. Victor had been clear about that. I started a notebook of my own. On one page, I drew the rough shape of the land from memory and wrote the parcel numbers next to it. On another, I listed company names that appeared more than once. On another, I wrote dates of letters and how they lined up with the entries in my father's small black notebook. Sometimes, when the generator noise got too loud in my head, I walked outside and followed the trail to the lake. The flags out there looked less like random markers now and more like punctuation marks in a sentence I was slowly learning to read. On the second day, I drove back into town and stopped at the ranger station. Caleb was there, sitting at a desk surrounded by maps and photos and a big radio unit. He looked up, surprised but not unhappy to see me. I told him I had been looking at old documents. I told him they mentioned surveys and boundaries. I asked if he knew where I could get copies of any official maps filed with the state. He nodded slowly, then pulled out a drawer and started flipping through folders. He said land records were public, more or less. He said people rarely asked for the ones this far out. He found a thick folder with Holt written on the tab and laid it on the desk. We went through it together. Some of the maps matched what I had in the cabinet. Same lines, same codes. Others were older, with hand-drawn lines and faded ink. There were notes from state inspectors and surveyors, little stamps with dates. I didn't take the originals, but he let me photograph them there at the desk. He watched me carefully, like he was measuring my reactions. When I finished, he asked me a simple question. "Do you know what you've got?" he said. I told him the truth. Not fully, not yet. But enough to know it wasn't just a broken cabin and a nice view. He nodded at that. He said my father had been right to be cautious. He said this place made people greedy. His tone made it clear he wasn't talking about me. On the way out, I asked him if he would mind if I listed him as someone who had seen the land and the markers recently, just in case there were questions later. Something about usage, boundaries, maintenance. It was a vague ask, but he understood. He shrugged and said he was just doing his job, but if someone needed to confirm that the Holt land had been actively monitored and not abandoned, he could say so. He wrote his full name and title on a scrap of paper and slid it across the desk to me. Back at the cabin that night, I propped my phone up on the table and called Victor again. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had found since we last spoke. The markers, the ranger's records, the matching maps. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said that was very good work. He said most people in my position would have panicked or ignored everything and tried to sell whatever they could as fast as possible. He sounded almost relieved that I hadn't done that. Then his voice shifted slightly, became more professional, more clipped. He said he had pulled my father's file and gone through every line. He said the land around the cabin had been gathered quietly over many years. Some parcels had been bought directly, others had been won in disputes or auctions. All of it had been placed under structures I didn't fully understand but that he had designed. He said my father's goal had been simple: keep control in the family and make sure it went to someone who understood the value of patience. My throat felt tight at that. I asked him what happened now. He said there were steps we could take before that celebration dinner, things that would not reveal anything yet, but would make positions very clear on paper. He said he would email me some documents, and I should read them carefully, sign where indicated, and send them back securely. He said these steps would not be visible to my mother or brother in their daily lives, but they would matter when questions came. I started to ask what exactly the documents did, what they changed, what they triggered, but he cut me off gently. "Let me worry about structure," he said. "You focus on understanding what you own and how you want to speak about it when the time comes." I agreed to that. After we hung up, his email arrived. I opened it and saw attached files full of dense language and references. I read them slowly, 3 times. It was like reading a machine manual for a machine that controlled other machines. They mentioned designations, protections, rights of use, representation. They did not list dollar amounts. They did not mention Tyler or my parents by name. They made sure that whatever happened with the land, I was the one people would have to talk to. I signed them electronically, following Victor's instructions, and sent them back. I didn't feel like I had just done something dramatic. It felt like tightening bolts on a structure that had already been built, not dropping a bomb. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The next morning, my phone pinged again. This time it was a private message from Tyler, not in the group chat. He wrote that he was glad I had decided to come to the dinner. He said it would be good publicity to show that the family was united. He joked that maybe some of his investor friends would be there, and I could network if I stopped acting like a hermit. He added a line at the end that made me stop. He wrote, "Make sure you bring pictures of your cabin. People love rustic stuff." I stared at that message for a long moment, then wrote back a simple reply. "I'll bring what I need." He sent back a laughing emoji and a thumbs up, like everything was a game. The night before I left Alaska, I walked down to the lake one last time. The sky was clear. Stars burned hard and cold above me. The flags looked almost black against the snow in the dark. My breath streamed out in front of me. I tried to imagine the hills not as quiet shapes, but as numbers, values, contracts, projects, mines, whatever companies saw when they looked at maps like the ones in my father's cabinet. Then I tried to imagine my father standing here, telling those people no, again and again, waiting for something, waiting maybe for me to grow a spine and show up. Back at the cabin, I packed my bag, clothes, the black notebook, my own notebook, copies of the photos on a small drive tucked into a side pocket. I didn't touch the cabinet again. I locked the hatch, smoothed the rug over it, shut off the generator, and stood in the doorway for a second. The cabin looked like a broken inheritance again. To anyone else, it would be nothing special. I pulled the door shut behind me and walked to the truck. The trip back to New York was a blur of airports and plastic seats and announcements over crackling speakers. The closer I came to the city, the more my phone buzzed, work emails, a message from my manager asking if everything was all right, a reminder about a project deadline, another note from my mother with a seating plan for the dinner. I replied to my manager that I'd be back in the office after the weekend. I told my mother any seat was fine. She wrote that she had placed me at the family table near Tyler and some of his guests. She added that she hoped that would help you feel included. On the day of the dinner, I put on my best suit. It was not expensive, but it fit well. I slipped the small drive into an inside pocket next to my chest. I checked the folder in my bag for the 10th time. Photos printed on glossy paper, notes I had handwritten in large, clear letters. A simple summary Victor had prepared that looked harmless on its own. He had told me he would handle the heavy legal part later, in proper rooms with proper people. Tonight, he had said, would be about something else, drawing a line in public. I took the train up and rented a car from the small town near my parents' house. The drive up the familiar hill felt different now. The trees seemed to lean closer to the road. The house looked bigger and more fragile at the same time. The driveway was full of cars, expensive ones mostly. Tyler's leased SUV sat front and center. Lights glowed from every window. Music drifted out faintly when someone opened the front door. I parked near the end of the driveway, sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and took a slow breath. Then I got out, straightened my jacket, grabbed the folder, and walked up the steps. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there in an elegant dress, eyes bright. She hugged me hard, then stepped back and looked me up and down. She said I looked handsome. She said she was glad I was there. She said tonight was going to be special. Behind her, in the big hallway, people mingled with drinks in their hands. I saw cousins, neighbors, people I didn't recognize in expensive clothes. Laughter floated through the air. Tyler stood near the base of the stairs, talking loudly to a group of men. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my car. When he saw me, he grinned wide and spread his arms like he was welcoming a guest of honor. "Look who made it," he said, raising his voice just enough for nearby people to hear. I stepped over the threshold, the house swallowing me in light and sound, and felt dozens of eyes turn in my direction. The speeches were exactly what I expected. My parents praising Tyler's vision, his friends talking about the Holt legacy. When my mother asked if I wanted to say a few words, Tyler laughed and told me to keep it short. I did. I laid Victor's summary and a satellite map on the table. I explained calmly that the cabin lot was over 10,000 acres with mineral rights, that every company who'd courted my father now had to come through me, and that the mansion had been bought with income from my land. The room went silent. I left the folder where it was and walked out.